Hey everyone, it's Lauren. Back in early March, we were collecting stories from first generation college students about their experiences on campus. Since then, COVID 19 hit college campuses across the country, and we're now seeing a rising number of cases since students have returned for in person learning. We wanted to know how first generation college students are marking milestones and navigating postgraduate life during the pandemic. So we're sharing the story of a first generation college student who we met at the University of Missouri, or Mizzou, back in March during her senior year.
I'm Raven Jackson. I'm from Chicago. I'm a senior here at the University of Missouri, Columbia, majoring in health science. I'll be graduating this May. My dad talked to me all the time, so it's always going to college, going to college, going to college. And he knew times was changing. So he like, nowadays you need a bachelor's to get a job. And almost now, my age, you need a master's to get a really good job. So in my mind, I was always thinking, like, if I want to be successful and wealthy, I have to go to school. So that's why in my head, I always knew school.
And the pressures of being the first in a family to go to college weren't easy. But understanding how the lack of post-secondary education affected the financial stability of her family motivated her to reach higher.
So I think he pushed me so hard to go to school because he wasn't able to. And he knew that he could have been so much capable of doing other things. And then my grandma, another reason why I wanted a good job is because she worked for a church. And it was Catholic church, so they go through Catholic charities. So it's like their own funding, which is very, very difficult. So she didn't even have, like, good benefits that she should have. And she literally worked until she was about 80 years old. And my family knew, like, we don't want you working this long. We know you can beat the odds and everything. And then my dad worked until he had to retire because he became an amputee. But he would work doing bus driving. And I just would see all their pain from coming from work. Like, they did it just to put food on the table and keep a roof over our heads and clothes on our back. But it was still like they knew this is not what they wanted to do. So I knew with them pushing me that I needed to be something that I want to be and be happy with life, because I know that also caused a lot of problem and pain within, like, our family.
Understanding how to finance your degree can be tricky, with many students like Raven having to learn on the fly how to apply for loans, find scholarships, and find work-study jobs to help reduce costs.
So I did FAFSA, but instead of doing .gov, I clicked on .com. So I did the same exact FAFSA, but they made me pay at the ear. And I didn't know that. So after it had happened, I was telling, I think my sister or somebody about how, like, I was like, yeah, FAFSA made me pay. And she was like, it's supposed to be free. I'm like, no, it's not. Maybe in your time, not mine. So then that's when we looked. She like, girl, because you did .com. So that was definitely a learning experience. So, like, all my other years of doing FAFSA, I knew, like, .gov. Like, that was a learning experience. My dad, he was the one who was real big on money because at the end of the day, he was my financial support. So he wanted me to go to the community college that was within our area. So I was just like, I definitely don't want to go to community college. I'm like, I want to go away. I want to get the experience. I want to do something different. But it was definitely a challenge of trying to, I don't know, just really giving me that oomph that I want to go to school.
Eventually, Raven received the Diversity Award Scholarship and other financial support to pursue her college education at Mizzou. And while she was there, she found her calling.
I went through a RT, but then I realized it was something that I liked to do, but it still wasn't my passion. But doing RT, I was able to come across all the respiratory therapists at the university hospital who were all getting their masters in public health. So then that's when I looked to public health, and then I was like, oh, so I can't get my bachelor's in public health, but maybe I can just go and get my master's. And that's when I looked into HIV/AIDS research. And I want to bring more awareness to HIV. So both my parents had it, and I had a brother who had it as well. They all passed away. But that's why I knew, like, okay, I think this is what I need to be doing. Because I have family who have respiratory issues, but they're still living. But HIV, I feel like that's more prevalent in a lot of places, and it don't get the proper avocation like it should get. So that's when I just dropped from the RT program because I didn't want to keep pushing through, knowing that's not what I want to do anymore. And I ended up doing health science straight through. But trying to figure out what I wanted to do was definitely a challenge. And I had my moments where I just like wanted to give up because I'm like, what am I supposed to do? Like, where is God leading me? It's really hard to keep going forward when you really don't know the direction to go. But then I just had to release that and just go with the flow because my dad was really like a strict person. Like, that's how my mind was trained. And with him not being here, I began to have that mindset like, okay, this how he was. But some stuff I just had to let go and say like, okay, that's how he was, but that's not how I have to be. And so I just been letting it go with the flow ever since.
As her senior year was winding down, she was hit with another level of adversity. The COVID 19 pandemic caused Mizzou to close for in person classes on March 13th to reduce the spread, so we decided to catch up with Raven about her concerns.
The president, UN president, had sent out a mass email stating that, we won't have school, starting like cutting off to this day, and then I think they said they'll try to resume like that Friday, if I'm not mistaken. And that's when they just said, okay, at this point, we just not gonna have school at all, and you all just will come back after spring break. And that was like a week before we would start spring break. And then that's when, after that, when spring break started, that's when they pushed it back more to April. So it made everything just keep pushing, keep pushing. I'm going to miss a few senior send-off activities that Mizzou offers, and then just not having in-person access where I can just like go to my teacher's office hours like I wanted to, because I was in the process of applying to grad school. So like I was getting help from them and like making sure I'm staying on track for graduation and everything. And I normally work on campus, so like that's has been affected, and I don't have a computer, so also with campus being closed down, I wasn't able to do my homework back at school, so I had to come back to Chicago to be with family and friends and be able to have access to a computer device in order to do my homework. So it definitely made a lot of different changes.
But the changes to the day to day life of a college student wasn't Raven's biggest disappointment. Due to the pandemic, her graduation ceremony was canceled, and being a first generation college student, that special day mattered to her greatly.
My family, like, they been very empathetic of the situation because they know how much graduation meant to me, and everybody was ready to celebrate because we don't normally come together much as a family. So that was like one of like our reasons of coming together for good things, because a lot of people in my family recently have been passing away. So it was always sad, sad, sad. So this would have been a happy moment. But my family are still willing to like plan something with me and have something for the family to celebrate my accomplishment. I was always taught that no matter what may come in front of you, you can't let that stop you from getting to the finish line. I've just always been a person to just keep going no matter what the situation may be. And so I know I have plans, dreams, goals, and everything that I need to accomplish. And graduation is one of them, and I've made it so far. So why give up now in any sort? Because I know like when this is over, I'll be able to like I'm going to beat it. So when all this is over, like I can't stop myself and put anything on pause, because that's just not how life works. Like time will always keep going. So I just gotta cherish the time and use it to my advantage.
Months passed, but she still heard nothing about possibly rescheduling or providing virtual options to celebrate her special day. And a Mizzou student eventually started a petition. We demand a graduation for Mizzou 2020 graduates on change.org, which states that the university has allowed 10,000 fans at football games but won't schedule a commencement.
When they send us emails, especially me still being a student, kind of like get into the strong still of not having the advantage of walking the stage due to the pandemic and everything, which is understandable because they want to protect our safety. But I also find it a bit inconsiderate of the lack of showing our accomplishments of graduating when they still decide to host football games, but say that our graduation would be too dangerous when they act like as if they can't come up with different solutions of having graduations.
like other schools have done and taking that into consideration. It's like their main focus is mostly on like things that are more so beneficial within them financially. When it came to our graduation, they just had a celebration where like they just posted pictures of us. It wasn't even like as if we had a slideshow that showed all the graduates going across the screen, or having them call our names and our family gather around at home and we just listen to it, still getting the feel of it. Sometimes I think that I didn't even graduate, especially with me going back straight into school again.
Since returning to Mizzou as a grad student studying public health, she's noticed familiar patterns about how Mizzou handles students' concerns, such as the petition to remove the Thomas Jefferson statue on campus and the uprising for Black lives taking place across the country. Since Raven was a freshman in 2015, the university has continued to make national headlines for its lack of response to racism.
Mizzou just continues to do whatever they want to. It's like they make this big old scene and say all of these things about how they listen to their students, that they want us to feel comfortable, that anything that we want done that they will do for us. It's just like they make it sound good, but when it actually comes to us wanting these things, it's as if they didn't expect that we will ask for it. And so that's when they get quiet or they get defensive. I feel like that's just not how you run certain things. I see how many students try to put into the effort of making those changes. And with me being back at home, it kind of like frustrates me because I was forcing the fact of trying to go back to school so I can be one of the students to help make a change. But due to certain situations that I'm in, I'm unable to. But I know somewhere down the line, I won't stop trying to fight to make changes at Mizzou because I feel like this will always be a reoccurring issue. And so I just feel like once school is over with, I will be able to help more. It's hard. It's difficult, especially just being there for 5 years and then continuing further my education there and still just dealing with the same thing for so long. And it's just like when you just wonder to yourself, like, when will it ever end? Like, it's something every time. It does shows a lack of respect towards our Black brothers and sisters because we feel as if our school is supposed to stand behind us, but it's like they're not. They're in front of us. They're on the other side. And it's like, how do you expect us to be comfortable or feel we should stay in a school and being around this environment if the school isn't willing to work with us? And so it's saddening because you go to school for an education, to better yourself, to enhance your future, your career and everything. But instead, we have students who is distracted by their academics because they're trying to fight racial injustice. And the fact that Mizzou will send an email stating, "Oh, we stand by you," but it's just words. It's no actions being shown with that. And that's what I don't understand. And it's just so many questions that I have. It's like I give how I feel or say like what must be done, but it's just like, what will Mizzou do? Like, what do they think? Because they tell us what we want to hear, but we never know the honest truth. And so that's just something I've always questioned myself and like how to go about that in order to find a change and see like what can be done. It's unfair to students to have to deal with such a thing, especially for those who may have not even like dealt with these situations at a school before. And so it may be new to them.
COVID-19 continues to impact her life, but she's continuing to press on.
It definitely affected me where I lost my housing. I don't have a job. It's been very, very difficult in finding jobs due to the pandemic. So that's another thing. I am grateful to be able to have the teacher assistant job and work away from school and not have to be on campus. So that's helpful. I lost my car, so me not having a job and trying to work and gain as much money as possible to try to work on getting a new car, that's been having me down and out. I think just me taking it slow, staying patient, staying the course, that everything will fall together soon.
Mizzou isn't the only college campus that is dealing with the virus and student-led uprisings, but the experiences of students fighting for transparency and change are the result of efforts to address racism on campus for years. So in this episode, we hear from a health reporter about what it's like to report about the virus at a university and a student activist working behind the scenes to uplift Black students during a pandemic and an uprising. From St. Louis Public Radio and PRX, this is We Live Here. The University of Missouri, or Mizzou, has been scrutinized by students and state lawmakers for its COVID-19 response. Their concerns range from the housing and meals provided to students in quarantine to the rising number of cases in Columbia, Missouri, where the school is located. To help us understand Mizzou's challenges, we spoke to Sebastian Martinez Valdivia, a health reporter at KBIA, Mid-Missouri's NPR member station, which is located on campus at Mizzou. Sebastian explains that Mizzou began responding to COVID-19 at the end of spring 2020.
We had our first case in the state, and then I think it was just a week and a half or 2 weeks later that we called off in-person classes for the semester. And I believe at that time we hadn't had any students test positive. There weren't many cases in Columbia, and it just seemed to be kind of following the national trend. It happened very quickly, that transition. They closed the public schools, and then they transitioned us into online teaching. And all of those decisions seem to have been made over the course of maybe a week or two. It seemed like it accelerated very quickly.
But as the summer months approached and the state began opening up, cases started going up in July.
And the perception had kind of shifted. Some people have talked about COVID fatigue, people kind of being tired of taking the precautions that they needed to take. The state opened up a couple months earlier, and other states were doing that. So there was this kind of, I'd say, like national perception that the COVID situation had improved.
Even though cases were rising, the university began planning for in-person learning for the fall semester.
So a lot of instructors were asked by their direct supervisors and by their associate deans if they preferred to teach in person or if they preferred to teach remotely. And a lot of those decisions were kind of made back in June when the situation, again, on the ground here in Columbia was very different. We were in the teens and 20s in terms of new cases.
They rolled out COVID precautions in late July, but mostly attempted to make in-person learning feel as normal as possible, despite concerns from instructors.
They made it clear that they were still going to operate the dorms, and residential life was still going to be open as normal, so they weren't reducing capacity in terms of how many students could live in the dorms. They kind of made it clear that they were going to try to make this feel as normal as possible. That's meant not doing things like doing, regular asymptomatic testing or random sample testing.
When students returned to campus for in-person learning in late August and early September, Columbia had a huge spike in cases.
I've definitely heard from instructors, mainly privately, concerns about teaching in person, about those precautions not necessarily being followed. So students sitting closer than 6 feet apart and not necessarily following mask requirements. But the precautions that the university spelled out were mostly just about mitigating the spread of the virus on campus.
Students also shared their frustrations about the inconsistent information and inadequate resources provided by the school. And the university would later admit that they were not fully prepared for the number of students who would test positive and need quarantine housing, despite its claims in early July that they were ready for in-person learning.
There were a lot of students testing positive. There were hundreds of new cases every day. And the students who I spoke to back then who expressed having negative experiences complained about inconsistencies in terms of the information that they were receiving. So how long they needed to stay quarantined, where they needed to quarantine, if they needed to go to the university's quarantine housing, which they contracted with a local hotel. And then they also had, I understand, some facilities of their own. And also there were a lot of complaints about not getting meals or the meals being inadequate. And it all kind of painted a picture of the university not having necessarily been fully prepared for the amount of students testing positive and needing that quarantine housing, which is something that the administration has kind of admitted in some interviews, suggesting that the argument that they've made is that nobody could be fully prepared for what was going to happen. Although that is kind of the image that they seem to be trying to project back in July. So there's some inconsistency there.
Even today, the university struggles to make tests accessible to students. There are eligibility requirements that prevent or slow down testing, and many students feel that there are too many downsides and too little support for staying quarantined.
There's one testing site on campus that you can walk up to that's available to students. And then there's two drive-through testing sites that the local hospitals are operating. And both of those, well, for all of them, you need an order from a medical provider, so a nurse or a doctor. And so they've got a phone line for people to call in to get pre-screened to get those tests. But accessibility of testing has definitely been a big concern that I've seen raised a number of times, because there's comparable college towns where you can do walk-up testing with no provider order and sometimes with no appointment, but that's obviously not the case here. And so that has been a big concern that I've seen from a number of students. I think that there is kind of a disincentive for students to get tested, because if they get tested and they test positive, they know that they're going to have to quarantine. They won't be able to go to class. They won't be able to hang out with their friends necessarily. And so there isn't like a good incentive for them to voluntarily go get tested if they start showing symptoms.
The university relies on students, faculty, and staff to self-report symptoms, which can result in incomplete and inaccurate data.
There's an app that students are supposed to use, and faculty and staff, to self-report symptoms, but that's all just based off of your own self-reporting. So there's no other way of double checking that. If you have symptoms but you want to say that you don't have symptoms, you can do that. And then also, that app isn't, to my knowledge, being checked anywhere aside from two locations that they just announced last week. So like other universities have had people posted at the doors to buildings where classes are being held to check if students have done the app and if they've come up with no symptoms. But the university is only starting to do that at the rec center and at the library, and they only announced that last week, 8 weeks into the semester.
But being discouraged to get tested and being told that managing the virus is about personal responsibility doesn't just happen at the university.
Even if you're not a college student, there is kind of that disincentive to go get tested, because there's no necessarily guarantee from your job that you're not going to be laid off for testing positive, et cetera. Like that's something that businesses are legally entitled to do here in Missouri, and there isn't that extra unemployment support that we had earlier. So those are kind of systemic problems that are reflected in the university as well, I would say.
Unlike broader society, universities often have their own systems for reporting COVID-19 cases, with varying levels of coordination with local health departments.
I've seen a lot of people express doubt in the university, and a lot of those criticisms have come back to kind of transparency. So there was a feeling early on that the university wasn't putting out as much information as other universities were. And there were definitely other universities' dashboards that were a lot more robust in terms of presenting like where clusters of cases have occurred and that sort of thing. And that also comes back to the testing question of how many students are being tested.
Making things more complicated is the relationship between the university and the city and county that the school is located in.
The university had initially said that it would have its dashboard on how many students have tested positive, but that would be updated maybe once a week. And they initially didn't say that students would be required to self-report when they've tested positive. The city county health department would process all of the positive tests. They'd get all the positive test reports, and then they would essentially flag the ones that were students so that then the university could take over the case investigation and the contact tracing. Early on when they were having that big influx, the city county health department was actually still helping out with case investigation and contact tracing of students in some instances, as the university hired more case investigators and contact tracers to kind of bulk up its own operation. But it was definitely complicated, and there was also some confusion with the students who would test positive and go home, or would go home and test positive in their city of residence, or their parents' city and county of residence. So there was some confusion with that, where initially the health department was putting the health departments in the places that they were going to in charge of following up with them.
But the city and the county don't have jurisdiction over campus property.
The city county health department doesn't have control over what the university does. They've been in consultation. I mean, the university could still do stuff. The health department isn't running the show on campus.
There's a continuing discrepancy when it comes to the surrounding city and county's limits on group sizes and the people allowed at MU football games.
In the city and in the county, the limits are you can't gather in groups of more than 20 people. But then you have, 11,000 people potentially in the stadium. And so there's some cognitive dissonance there. That's a kind of eye-catching discrepancy. But again, the city county health department couldn't do anything directly about that if they wanted to. They've said that they believe that if they made a suggestion to the university, it would follow it. But I spoke to the health department leading up to that first home game, and they said, we're just going to see what happens to the numbers after this game, and that'll inform us about whether we, advise against future games. And I actually went and I walked around downtown and to the stadium on the first home game where they had fans in the stadium. And the thing that I saw, which was technically allowed under the rules of both the county and the university, was, students partying, students out on their balconies in the apartments downtown, drinking and socializing and that sort of thing. So I think from a public health standpoint, that would be a point of concern. The health department director, when I spoke with her about the order on bars, made it clear that alcohol is a big risk and a big driver when it comes to transmission of the university, just because when people drink alcohol, they speak louder, they're less likely to take precautions, their risk assessment is, impaired or different.
The city health department was able to mandate a closing time for bars and restaurants, which they've since loosened.
The main kind of response that the health department did was to institute an order mandating that bars and restaurants that serve alcohol close at 10 p.m. and stop serving alcohol at 9. And so they've pointed to that as being one of the big factors in reducing the number of new cases.
The rise in cases among students on campus has also affected the surrounding community, which has resulted in tensions, especially when the number of cases prevented local public schools from reopening.
The increase in students saw an associated increase in community transmission. So when somebody tests positive for coronavirus and they don't know where they may have contracted it. And so that was factored in as well when it came to the decision to not having Columbia Public Schools classes in person, for example. And so that was kind of I'd say, relatively significant source of community resentment towards the university, because there was this impression that because the university decided to bring college students back, people couldn't have their kids in school. And so that's been kind of an ongoing stressor. And I've seen, even employees of the university expressing kind of ambivalence or frustration that, because these college students were brought back for in-person classes, they can't send their own kids to, middle school, elementary school, high school, et cetera.
And as we head into flu season, it doesn't seem that the university will do much to change their approach.
The university's pretty much indicated that they're satisfied with their approach so far and are going to continue with it. So for example, in a few weeks, we'll have Thanksgiving break and they're going to send the students home for a week and then they're welcome to come back. They said that they've encouraged students to stay here and have provided some more meal options for students who stay in the dorms. But other than that, their approach is relatively unchanged. So as somebody who covers this, my biggest concerns are related to that kind of hospital capacity issue, because we've had more and more people, more and more inpatients at our hospitals testing positive for COVID-19 or more inpatients with COVID-19, I should say. We every week we seem to hit a new high in that respect. And that's a major concern because when you have people in your hospital with COVID-19, it's a big drain on resources, just in terms of all the precautions that you have to take, in terms of keeping them isolated and protecting the people who are caring for them. But then also it's just kind of a strain on personnel, because the more people you have in your hospital who you're treating with COVID-19, the greater the fears are about contracting it yourself. So that's my biggest concern going into flu season, because you then have the compounding factor of the flu. And that's something that health providers who I've spoken to are really wary of. Because if you have just a baseline of COVID inpatients, if there's a spike in cases, for example, here, or if there's an increase of, respiratory, people suffering from respiratory viruses, then your hospital capacity is already somewhat limited. And you have to make a lot of, adjustments to make sure that you can treat everyone.
Some have wondered why the university decided to reopen for in-person learning despite the risk to students.
I think it's kind of hard to ignore the financial pressures, especially given kind of the shift in the university's funding model over the last couple of decades. So, the university, like a lot of public universities of its size, at one point in time was getting more of its funding from the state than from student tuition. And that kind of flipped several years ago. And so now the university is extremely reliant on student tuition and like residential housing fees and stuff like that. And there is kind of an unspoken impression that if you didn't bring students back in person, you would lose money, or that students maybe would skip a semester or not enroll. And so that's something that I've seen kind of reflected in a number of universities, is that fear that if you didn't bring students back, you'd be losing money. But the university hasn't said that. They've exclusively said that they think that they can do this safely, and that's what their approach and their decisions kind of reflect.
And as Sebastian does his best as an educator and health reporter, what's carrying him through is his calling as a journalist to share accurate, up-to-date information with the public.
Oh God, it's tough. I think it's probably like not good from a mental health perspective, but I've never felt like the level of responsibility as a journalist that I've felt since the start of this pandemic. Like I've covered like some, big important stories before, but it's never felt as much like I need to communicate stuff to the community. I need to make sure that people are informed about this. And I've never really felt that way before. So right now, like I feel pressure, mainly like self-imposed, I would say, to kind of stay on top of things. And it's definitely tricky because I'm teaching now, that the semester has started, and I have to grade a bunch of student assignments and stuff in addition to trying to do my reporting, and I often feel like I'm not really doing enough. But it's mainly that idea that really ideal of journalism, right? That we're doing stuff in the public service, that has motivated me to stay on top of this and try to do good reporting.
In the meanwhile, Mizzou students have been organizing for greater transparency, access to testing, and safety for Black students on campus. So up next, we hear from a student activist and resident advisor who will share how students are continuing to fight for racial justice on campus in the midst of a pandemic. As the pandemic and the uprising continue, students at the University of Missouri have started their own movements for change. COVID Safety for MU started as an online petition and a Twitter account demanding transparency, testing, and online instruction. To understand how Mizzou's COVID-19 response and the movement to improve it has been affecting students on campus, we spoke to Roche Hemmings, a journalism student, activist, and resident advisor at the university.
I think that the lack of testing is problematic, honestly. I also think the lack of transparency is a bit weird. I feel like, at least what I've heard from like administration and stuff like that, is that like cases are going down allegedly, but I kind of feel like that's hard to deduce if not everyone on campus is being tested regularly or semi-regularly. Especially, I feel like I'm an RA, and so we don't get tested, and I feel like maybe we should, just because we do interact with like large portions of the MU population. So I don't know, I think testing for me is definitely a big thing. I think because everyone is online, having grassroots movement start on like Twitter or something, it gets people's eyes on it maybe sooner, and gets a lot more people looking at different movements and different injustices maybe that weren't apparent before. I feel like as far as COVID safety at Mizzou is concerned, I think that everyone maybe doesn't know about Mizzou specifically and how Mizzou is handling COVID, but I think that when back to school time came around and, different colleges and universities were kind of stating what their response was going to be, whether everything was going to be online or in person or what have you. I think people had a hyper awareness of what universities were doing. So I think there was already kind of that intrigue from the public. And now having an organization such as COVID Safety for MU kind of maybe broadcast what Mizzou isn't doing the best, I think it's a lot more impactful during this time.
But COVID safety for MU isn't the only movement making its presence known on campus. For years, students have been organizing to remove a statue of Thomas Jefferson that was installed on campus in 2001. And this year, there has been a renewed push to remove the statue as people across the country have removed statues and Confederate monuments as a part of the uprising for Black lives. At Mizzou, a recent online petition to remove the Jefferson statue gained traction with over 3,000 signers, but was denied by the university, which instead installed an acrylic case over the statue. In response, students formed a group called Mizzou 600, named after the 600 people who were enslaved by Thomas Jefferson, and 600 plus hours of disruption promised by the group until Mizzou shows them that hashtag Black Students Matter. And while Roche is not a member of Mizzou 600, the group's strength to stand up for what they believe in empowers her to do the same.
I think like right now there is, because of everything that took place, the horrible atrocities that took place this summer, and the murders of innocent Black people, like there's just a hyper awareness when it comes to racial injustice in this country, BLM. And so I feel like for me, having an organization like Mizzou 600 kind of relate what's happening in the world kind of on a smaller level here on campus in a way, it's kind of inspired me to speak out a bit more, but also to have like important conversations within my inner circles, like with my friends, with family, and just people that I interact with. It's definitely kind of encouraged me more to kind of state my opinions, maybe in a way that I wouldn't have before.
But students say that after organizing a protest on October 2nd, they were threatened with disciplinary action, and for Roche, this is just a mirror reflection of past movements for racial justice.
I think that any powerful and impactful movement, it's never going to be, in my opinion, something that is comfortable, something that is nice necessarily. And by nice, I mean something that is respectable and something that pleases everybody. Sometimes change is hard and it's loud and it's messy and maybe what some people would call destructive or disruptive. But I think that sometimes that's just the way that things have to be. I mean, you can cite really any civil rights movement in this country, but if we want to centralize it to Mizzou, like 2015, you know what I mean? Like that was disruptive, you know, and that wasn't necessarily like conducive to productivity at the university or whatever, you know, kind of scholarly or, you know, language that people want to use surrounding the issue, but like they got stuff done. And so I don't know, I feel like as far as disciplining students, like, do I understand it? Okay, if I'm to put myself in the position of an administrator, maybe, but like, I also think that there's some serious problems on this campus. There's some serious issues in this university, and I think that it's so ingrained into the fabric of this university, just like the fabric of this country, that we almost don't notice it anymore. You know what I mean? But it's like, someone has to do something, I feel like, to illuminate these things and bring these things to light, because just because it's been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, doesn't mean that it's okay, and doesn't mean that it's a system or something that works in the favor of all people. You know, that's just not how things are in this country, and it's not how things are in this university. Mizzou is not exempt.
The university's decision to contextualize the Thomas Jefferson statue rather than remove it altogether is causing a real strain between students and administrators.
Yes, Thomas Jefferson. had slaves. Yes, he had over 600 slaves. Yes, he, raped Sally Hemings and yes, he did these bad things. But he also did some amazing things too. I think that's what they mean by contextualizing. And to me, that doesn't make a lot of sense, just because, like, to me, it almost kind of says that, like, yeah, he did these terrible things, but he also did these really great things too, almost as if those great things can absolve him of the terrible things that he's done. And that's not how that works. At least not for me. That's not how anything like that works. And so I think by Mizzou administration really pushing this idea of, like, well, let's contextualize Thomas Jefferson. Let's contextualize Thomas Jefferson. To me, it just kind of feels like you're trying to sweep an important issue under the rug. And I also think that it kind of speaks to this idea that, like, race and racial inequality kind of lives in a vacuum, if that makes sense. And this idea that, like, I've heard the argument just in general my whole life that, like, oh, not everything has to do with race, not everything has to do with race, but quite literally everything has to do with race. And that's why it's called systemic racism and oppression. And so to me, when I hear that idea of, like, contextualizing, to me, it kind of reads kind of like the same energy of that argument, where it's like, no, like, the fact that he was part of the system, that he was able to have 600 slaves, that is a problem. And the fact that this university is propping up this figure, that is a problem. You know what I mean? Like, it's systemic racism. It is systemic oppression. And for this narrative of, like, contextualizing him to keep being pushed, I feel like it's to me, it feels like blatant disregard for what we know to be, a system that has disenfranchised Black and brown people for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I think for Mizzou students to be speaking out and for that narrative to still be, like, shoved down our throats, I don't know. It's just really disappointing, and it feels like they're not listening.
But students like Roche have found that setting up meetings and having conversations can only go so far in producing the change that they seek.
For me, being in organizations and having had opportunities to talk with administrators, like, and having friends and peers that are in leadership positions, and having the opportunity to talk with leaders and administrators on this campus, but also in the system as a whole, like, we bring these conversations to administration. Like, when we have meetings and bring forth our agendas and we talk about these things, whether it be the Thomas Jefferson statue or having more Black students on campus, or increased scholarships, or recruitment of Black faculty and staff, or tenure for Black faculty and staff. All of these little, like, things that are systemic, you know what I mean? They're trying to break that systemic racism and oppression. Like, we come into these spaces and have these conversations, and I'm sure that leaders prior to, like, me being here, my peers being here, have had those conversations, and I'm sure there are going to be leaders on this campus that do that when we leave. But how many times can you have a conversation, and how many times can you hear, oh, we'll get back to you about that, or, keep getting the runaround before we say, like, okay, well, we're going to have to do something else, or we're going to have to be a little bit more abrasive or destructive or disruptive, whatever people want to categorize it as, in our approach. Before we came back in the fall, like, I said to some of my friends and even to my family, I was like, there's going to be, like, protests and stuff on campus. How can there not be? You know what I mean? Like, people can only be so diplomatic and appeasing for so long before you're like, okay, we need to ramp it up, and take a different approach. And so I don't fault anyone that's trying to create some kind of movement on this campus. And I would encourage administration, instead of reprimanding and disciplining participants and activists and organizers, I would encourage them to kind of listen to what they're trying to say and come up with an actionable plan to enact some of the things that they want to get done, because people aren't chanting and yelling for nothing. You know what I mean? Maybe it'd be one thing if they were, but they're not. Like, these people are incredibly intelligent and well-versed, and their interests and their passions span across so many intersections. These people know what they're talking about, so listen to them when they speak.
The pandemic and the uprising have heightened the need for Black students to have a safe campus. So we asked Roche, what's at stake if the university doesn't cater to Black students' needs?
There are going to be more students, more people that are incredibly outspoken. I know for me, I've been at Mizzou, this is my third year, and I don't think I've ever seen like so many advocacy like groups or just like grassroots organizations, I guess, like Mizzou 600, the COVID safety response group, still concerned faculty. Like, there's just like so many orgs that were created over the summer, I feel like, that are like speaking out. And I also feel like, in a way, there's kind of like, to bring it back to my journalism classes, there's like this citizen journalism that's happening where it's like there are so many people that are hearing things in their respective organizations that are like sending things to the Maneater, sending things to the Missourian. Like, people have a heightened awareness of what's going on, whether it be racism or whether it be a poor response to COVID. Mizzou really right now needs to be on their P's and Q's, I feel like, because everybody is watching. Everybody, I feel like, in a way, is waiting for some kind of demonstration, outward demonstration of what we know to be true at this university. Because we can say that like things are unfair or that we're not safe here, right? But like, unless you can actually see it, then it's kind of like, okay, well, whatever, what are you talking about? Like that thing that I said earlier, like, oh, we can just sweep it under the rug. But I feel like there have been so many instances over the summer and this semester where people have blatantly shown like we should not be here because we are potentially like in danger of getting this virus, or Black students are not being treated properly on this campus, or what have you. And so I just kind of feel like my hope is that administration and the meetings that they have, not only with students, but with each other, I really just hope that they're actually kind of reflecting on everything that's happened up until this point and are really having conversations, internal conversations, and figuring out what can we do to make this university better.
But the one thing that is motivating her to continue the fight is the hope that she can make this world a better place.
I think the things that I'm involved in are important to me because they like speak to something greater, which sounds like so like corny, right? But they're important. They're important. And I think that like things that have gone on for years and years and years and years and years and years and years, like just because like it exists, like I said earlier, like that does not mean at all that it's okay. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know, like I was talking to a group of friends about it and I kind of equated it to like smoking. Like there was a time where smoking was like really cool and everyone loved to do it, but like didn't mean that it didn't destroy your lungs. You know what I mean? Like just because these systems are in place and they've been in place since the construction of this country, when, you know, it was ripped away from Indigenous people, like just because that's the way that things have been doesn't mean that they shouldn't get better and that they need to get better. And so I think for me, like if me saying anything at this university, because this university is part of the greater system, like if me saying something and being part of something that's a proponent of change can do anything to help change something, then, you know, hopefully I'm doing something right. And hopefully I'm, I don't know, making things better for the people that come after me. Something that I was actually talking about with a friend a couple days ago as well, is that when it comes to any type of change happening, that like, yes, protesting is important, but that we all have our own skill sets. We all have things that we're really, really good at. And that when it comes to the fight for justice and equality, we have to use our passions and our talents to kind of propel the movement forward. And I would like to think that I have a talent for writing. And so as much as like there are moments like this morning, crying to like one of my journalism instructors where I just want to quit and I don't want to do this anymore, like I understand that like me getting this degree and me working toward a better future for myself as a Black woman, like that's not only going to help me in the long run, but it's going to help my family and it's going to help people at this university. Hopefully it's going to help people hopefully like in the country, and most importantly, like it's going to help people, little girls that look like me, you know what I mean? Like I have a little cousin, and like if she ever chose to come to Mizzou, like I really, really hope that like she is not fighting for the same stuff that we're fighting for right now. The first Black students that came to Mizzou, like I bet they were thinking, like I really hope that people years and years and years and years and years after us are not fighting for the same thing that we're fighting for right now. So like sometimes it's really easy to get like so discouraged, but like we just have to keep going, you know what I mean? And as for this degree, like I want to write for a publication that has a really large readership so we can have conversations about systemic racism and oppression and talking about shaking up these systems, you know? Like we have to, you know, come into these spaces and change things up, because if we don't, like it's not, who else is going to do it? You know what I mean? Because like as we know, there are some people that are really content with things staying the way that they are, but like I'm not. So I don't know. I just want to do my part. I don't necessarily feel like I'm doing a lot. Like I just want to say that, but like I kind of feel like if I can graduate from this institution and use my words to help something, like hopefully that's contributing something to the greater cause.
This show is produced by me, Lauren Brown, and lead producer, Jolly Ann Yang. From St. Louis Public Radio and PRX, this is We Live Here.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.